So I've had a lot of people recently ask me, is now the right time to upgrade? Or more specifically, what should I upgrade? Should I upgrade to a 3080? Who the hell needs a 3090? Well, in this video, I'm going to try and answer that and more. We're going to dive into really where you're going to get probably the most bang for your buck based on the information that we have right now. Now that the 3090 is out and we have real world performance real world benchmarks against the ones that came out for the 3080, I think now is probably a good time where we can truly start answering some of those questions about upgrading. Now, I'm not going to be doing my own benchmarks and showing graphs and things like that, namely because I don't have the cards. This information is going to be based off of all of the feedback and reports that have been coming out from other channels, such as JayzTwoCents or Gamers Nexus. There's plenty of others that are covering the specific details that have had their hands on these cards early. I highly recommend you guys go check out those reviews. Make your own assessments, make your own judgments based off of the information that those guys are providing. And don't trust any one report. Look across all the different people that are actually posting numbers and, take the average of it, take each one with a grain of salt, and make your own judgment based off the information that you have. For this video, I'm going to be using the data that I've seen coming from these sources to create some reasonable deductions about the best ways to move forward with potential system upgrades. Now, a lot of these questions have been coming in through Twitch chat, and if you aren't part of the Twitch community, you can join me there every Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, starting at 9:30 p.m. Pacific time. You can follow me in the link down below. We can continue this discussion and bring up more of your thoughts and what do you think is actually the best move right now with the information that we have. So let's jump in and start breaking down the information that we know. Okay, first off, let's look at the new line of NVIDIA graphics cards, because really that's the main thing that kicked off this whole conversation. And I'm going to be looking at my notes here just because I have a bunch of breakdown of information, some of the specs that have been reported, as well as the pricing information here. So we're looking at the 3070 versus the 3080 and the 3090. Okay, first off, let's look at price between the different cards. The 3070 is coming in at $499. The 3080 is coming in at $699. And the 3090 is coming in at $1499. Now, I'm going to save the 3090 till a little bit later in the conversation because it's definitely a special use case. It's not for everybody. NVIDIA has even come out and said that, saying that they actually have limited supply on it because it is designed for a small portion of the consumer base. Really, from a purely gaming standpoint, you're going to be looking at the 3070 versus the 3080. Now, there is a $200 price difference between the two, from the $499 to $699. All these numbers are in US dollars. Now, the uplift in performance, the 3070 is not out yet. So we're taking NVIDIA's numbers for the 3070, but we do have numbers coming back in for the 3080. And we can compare the initial numbers to see how NVIDIA's numbers fall in line for the 3080 versus the benchmarks that we're seeing in the real world. For the most part, they're actually pretty close. They're pretty on point. So we can assume that the numbers for the 3070 are going to fall in line. What that means is for a $200 price difference, essentially that is 40% more in cost. It sounds more than it is. I mean, you're literally talking going from $500 to $700. So for $200 more, you're essentially getting 46% more performance across the board. Looking at the straight numbers, you have 46% increased ray trace performance, 46% texture rasterization, as well as 46% in just theoretical performance overall. So you are literally getting what you pay for and then some. For me personally, if you are looking at getting a new graphics card, I've always been of the mindset of save the money and get the best thing you can. That makes sense, obviously, right? If I'm already spending $500, for me, I'm going to save $200 more and get something that's going to last me longer, that I'm actually going to get more use out of, that I'm actually going to get better performance out of. The $200 more to get 40+% more performance out of is 100% worth it to me. And that's really, I actually think that the price point is too close, and maybe they priced it that way initially and they plan to drop the price of the 3070 at some point. That would make sense to me. Like if the 3070 actually dropped to $399 at some point and the 3080 stayed around $699, I think then you'd have a much better case for the 3070 as a cheaper alternative. But for a $200 difference when you're already spending $500, personally for me, I'd save the $200, get the bigger increase. Like I said, that card is going to be able to stay with you longer. And for me, rather than spending another $400 in a year or two, I would rather spend the extra $200 now and try and keep this card as long as possible. Now the 3090 is coming in at $1499. Now, granted, this is all MSRP, right? That's more than double the MSRP of the 3080. Now, what are you getting for that increased performance? You're not getting twice the performance of the 3080. In fact, it's almost minimal. I mean, you're talking about a 10 to 20% uplift in performance, depending upon what resolution you're even working at. And in most cases at the lower resolutions, you're actually getting bottlenecked by your CPU. So this is where we can really start the conversation of which card is right to get, as well as should I be buying a CPU right now instead of a GPU? First off, what resolution are you gaming at? Are you sticking with 1080p? Are you moving up to 1440? Are you moving up to 4K? If you're already at the resolution you're going to be sticking with and not getting a new monitor, what frame rates are you getting already? Because how much of an improvement are you expecting to see for the additional money you're going to spend? One of the things that we're seeing heavily with the 3080 cards, and I'm mostly going to be referencing the 3080 cards because that's the only thing we have real world benchmarks to work against it right now, is that at 1080p and 1440, these cards are all getting bottlenecked by the CPU. The 1080p values are not that much greater than what you're getting from a 2080 Ti. So from that standpoint, depending upon what CPU you have, you may be better off putting money in your CPU first, because if you have an older CPU and you go ahead and you get a 3080, you may be losing out on a significant portion of performance there, whereas upgrading from maybe an i7 to an i9 may actually get you performance with your current setup. And if you're gaming at 1080p with a 2080 Ti, you're maybe only looking at a 10% performance increase from the 2080 Ti to the 3080. So again, there might be other places that money is better spent. I mean, if you're looking at a 3080 and you're looking at spending $700, at that point, you could replace your motherboard and your CPU, hang on to your 2080 Ti, and see what comes out down the road. I mean, we have some other announcements coming from AMD that we can talk about in a minute. The landscape's going to change over the next 6 months, so there's no need to jump into anything at this moment in time. Now, if you're at 1080p and your graphics card's a 2080, the 3080 may be worth it. Again, if you have a modern CPU and you don't have a lot of room to upgrade there, from the 2080 to the 3080, some of the channels are reporting almost a 90% improvement in frame rates, obviously depending upon the game. But there's a huge boost there. The place where you're not seeing a big boost is from something like the 2080 TiOC, like the Strix 2080 TiOC versus the 3080. Because when you overclock the 2080 TiOC versus a Founders Edition 3080, you're looking at maybe a 10% increase in performance, all the way up to 1440p. The area where these cards really shine comes in at 4K, because what you're doing is you're removing the CPU bottleneck, and all of the bottleneck really moves to the GPU at that point. And that's where these cards just accelerate. But for now, pretty much across the board, all of these cards are getting bottlenecked by almost every CPU that exists at the moment. The good thing about that is as new CPUs come out in the future, we're actually going to be able to drop those in and get FPS boosts off of our graphics cards, because their CPUs are going to be able to keep up with the GPUs that are so powerful. Right now at 1080p and 1440, these cards are essentially getting held back. So that's something to think about. You know, if you're gaming at 1080p, I don't know that getting a new graphics card's worth it, because you're probably already boosting well over 165. You might even be hitting 240 depending upon what your graphics settings are. You know, if your goal is to basically be at 240 with ultra, maybe. If you're trying to go for 240 gaming, is ultra settings really your goal? And again, this is where it comes down to, what are your goals for improving your system? So 1440p, again, I'm just looking at the specs here with the 2080 TiOC versus a 3080. you're looking at a 10% gain roughly from an overclocked 2080 Ti to the Founders Edition 3080. Is it worth putting that money into the graphics card? I mean, for 10% improvement, I don't know that I would bother spending the money right then, because what you're literally talking about roughly 10 to 15 frames in any game at that point in time. When you're looking from the 3080 to 3090, you're getting about another 10%. So there is a jump essentially from the 2080 TiOC to the 3080 Founders Edition. You're getting 10%. Then you're getting another 10% going to the 3090. So you're getting about a 20% improvement over the Founders Edition. Now, what's interesting is when you're actually looking at a cost analysis, what I paid for my Strix 2080 TiOC was roughly $1,300, right? And the 3090 is coming in at $1,500. So for what I spent for that card, if I wanted to spend roughly an equal amount, I am getting a 20% improvement. So I think that's where you actually have to have the discussion is like, what did you pay for your card originally? If you have a graphics card that's a 2080 that was roughly $700, $600 in the past, and now you're coming in and you're going to spend $700 on a new graphics card, and you're seeing that 90% boost over the original 2080, that's significant. And I would definitely say, yeah, that's a place if you're coming from a straight 2080, I think going to the 3080 does make sense if you are looking to spend that money. Now, again, a lot of this conversation has been focused around the lower resolutions, 1080p and 1440p. When we get into 4K, that's where things get interesting. Because like I said, you're removing the CPU bottleneck and you're putting the work back onto the GPU. Now, this is where these cards shine, right? So the 3080 has a massive boost in 4K over the 2080 Ti. I mean, you're talking about a 30% increase in performance versus at the lower resolutions, you're talking, you're in the 10 to 15 range. Now, the 3090 is even greater, but not that much greater. I mean, you're literally talking, again, maybe an additional 10% over the 3080. So why get a 3090? The 3090, if you're a gamer, it's not meant for you. That's the reality. 3090 is meant for production. Now, when I talk about production, I'm talking about digital content creation from the standpoint of post-production, animation, CG. We're talking the use cases of using V-Ray and Arnold and Blender and Octane and Redshift and other GPU-based renderers that are going to take advantage of these cards and the VRAM that's on them. The 24 gigs of VRAM on the 3090 is going to be used by these other applications. Games currently are not using that type of VRAM. I mean, you're maybe talking the 6 to 8 to possibly 10 range. You don't need this for gaming, especially if you look at the price point. You're going double the cost for such a small fractional performance boost. It's absolutely not worth it. Where I do think that things get interesting is with RTXIO. Now, what's RTXIO going to be used for? In gaming, loading of scenes, textures, you're looking at potential no load times because you're bypassing the CPU to load information from your SSD straight onto the VRAM of the GPU. Essentially, you're taking load off of the CPU, creating performance boosts across the entire chain. Now in production, we're looking at frame buffering for loading frames and video playback directly to the GPU rendering. And essentially at that case, the more VRAM, the better. The more information that can be held on the graphics card itself and keep that closer to the GPU, the faster real-time rendering is. And again, this is really used for production. Think about on a timeline, an editing timeline and compositing software where I want to play back my frames. What tends to happen now is currently, unless you're working off of an SSD RAID or something like that, you're essentially buffering information into memory. You're buffering each frame by frame into memory, and then it's playing back out of memory. And then essentially, you'll see an area in your timeline where it's green, right? And so those are the frames that are available in memory, and you'll start to see the ones behind start to fall off, and then there's more up in the front that it's trying to keep ahead of the playhead. And if you're trying to play back 4K 60, it's trying to read those frames off the SSD through the CPU, get those to the graphics card and get those processed. Now, For playback in this software, I mean, when you're playing back these long timelines, and I'm talking about fully uncompressed frames. I'm not talking about like a QuickTime movie. I'm talking about frames where you're rendering frame by frame and actually having to load each one dynamically. Loading directly to the GPU into the VRAM is huge. This is where RTXIO is actually going to shine in production systems. Typically for us in visual effects and post-production, we've been using Quadra cards, and we dabbled a bit trying to use some of these RTX cards, and they work, they're okay, but really the architecture doesn't perform the best. While they're great for gaming and they're optimized for gaming, they really don't work perfectly with things like Maya and Nuke. I mean, you can get by with them, but the Quadra cards just perform better. But those Quadra cards are multi-thousands of dollars. I mean, you're talking like $3,500 for a card. The 3090 fills a gap. You know, essentially they said it's replacing a Titan card. And in some ways, I think from a marketing standpoint, they should have kept that separation, because I think by just creating one more up in the chain, they're dangling this carrot to gamers that I don't even think they should be dangling. I mean, I think they should really be like, hey, we got the 3080, it blows everything out of the water. Use that, because I think they've confused a lot of people that aren't used to working in production and those types of systems of what the 3090 is actually good for, and why am I paying double for such a small percent increase in performance. Now, the great thing about RTXIO is it's going to be available on all Turing and Ampere cards. And so what that means is that as game developers start to take advantage of this technology and other software starts to take advantage of this technology, it's going to work with your 2080, right? It's going to work with your 2060, as well as just as well as your 3080 and 3070 and 3090 for that matter. The main difference is the VRAM, right? So the 3080 has 10 gigs of VRAM, which I believe is one less than the current 2080 Ti. The 3090 has 24 gigs of VRAM. Now, there has been rumors spreading around, and obviously, again, take it with a grain of salt. This is a rumor that there is potentially a 20 gig version of the 3080. For me, even in production, even in somebody that is looking forward to using this card in the digital content creation field, the 3080 Ti from the price point, well, I'm going to call it a 3080 Ti. We don't know what it's going to be called, but essentially the 3080 with 20 gigs of VRAM, if that's a reality, depending upon the price point, I mean, for me, it makes sense for that card to drop in around the $1,000 mark. But if it does, I still don't think there's a reason to go up to $1,500 for the performance difference for just 4 more gigs of VRAM. I think the $1,000 mark, a 3080 with 20 gigs of VRAM, actually really hits a sweet spot for me as an individual, with their own setup at home. Now, at the office, we're going to spend the money. We're going to probably go with the bigger cards that we can get, right? But as an individual, buying a system that I can work on out of my house and actually do render 3D animations and use GPU-based rendering, those cards with a higher VRAM are really, really interesting to me. Okay, so we've kind of stepped through the main differences between the 3070, the 3080, and the 3090. And we've talked about the impact of those at different resolutions and the resolutions you're gaming at. Now, I mentioned early on that if you're gaming at lower resolutions, maybe the money might be better spent going with upgrading your CPU. And if you need to, upgrading your motherboard. I know for me, if I want to go to a 10th gen, I need to upgrade to a Z470 over what I have now for my 9th gen i90-900K. So for me, I think I would initially put the money into the motherboard and getting a higher gen chip, because again, with the 2080 Ti, I'm not going to see those massive boosts going with a 3080. It just isn't there yet. Now, am I going to see a performance boost? Yes. Is it significant? I think I would actually get a better boost by having an overclocked CPU, that's actually pushing 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, something like that. Now, talking about CPUs, there's going to be a big shakeup coming, right? So we've got AMD's keynote announcement on October 8th, where they're going to be announcing Zen 3. And then on October 28th, we've got Big Navi and RDNA 2. Now, let's talk about Zen 3 for a second. My dream would be that they come out with a 12 and 16 core chip that's pushing over 5 gigs. The rumors out there is that they're going to be 4.8. It'll be interesting to see how much further past 4.8 those chips can be pushed, because if you're able to get an AMD chip that's pushing 5.0 gigs with 12 cores, then I actually think Intel has some real competition, because the main difference is right now, if you're looking purely at a gaming box, right, and you're not multitasking, you're not streaming, you're not trying to do other things simultaneously, Intel still wins hands down for core speed. And NVIDIA's already come out and said the 30 series cards respond better to core speed versus core count. Now, this is where AMD is currently winning in the core count area, right? The latest Intel chips are 10 cores. You know, last gen AMDs are coming in at 12 and 16. So, you know, hopefully we're going to see a refresh of those with higher core counts, and that's going to shake things up. So again, if you're looking to buy anything, I would absolutely wait until at least after October 8th to see what happens with the chips, because that may dictate, oh man, if I get, you know, AMD just dropped a 5 gigahertz 16 core chip, and that's going to have the biggest impact on my system, then great, go for it. If you're already at a 99900K and you've got a 1080 Ti, the 3080 might be the way to go and put your money there. I mean, so in some cases you really have to look at, again, it comes down to the resolution, what gen CPU do you have, and what gen GPU do you have? And you need to basically, you want to walk them up together, because if you have an old CPU and you're gaming at 1080p, there's almost zero reason to jump up to a 3080. It doesn't make sense. Upgrade to 1440, upgrade your motherboard, upgrade your CPU, and then upgrade your GPU. And I think you'll actually see benefits all along the way, versus just going over here and being like, it's not much different than what I was doing before, but you already just spent $600-700 on a new GPU. Now, October 28th, when they announce Big Navi, that'll be interesting, because personally, based on everything that I've seen, I don't think that AMD is going to come out with a card that dethrones the 3080, right? And I also think that's why NVIDIA is holding the 3080, like I said, we'll call it the Ti, in their back pocket as something to announce after AMD, just to steal a little thunder back, right? Just marketing games at this point. But essentially, if Big Navi comes in and they offer up a card at the same price point as the 3070, but has better performance, that's where, again, I don't know that the 3070 makes sense in any use case. Unless you're literally just like, I got $500 and that's all I got. And then, yeah, go buy the 3070. Nothing wrong with it. But again, if you can save a little bit more money, the performance boost of the 3080 is significant. So unless AMD comes in at the 3070 price with higher performance, or 3070 performance at a lower price, I don't really think there's going to be a reason to go there yet. But again, no one knows what's going to happen there, so it'll be really interesting to see. I think the big date, the more important date right now, is October 8th to see what happens with the new CPUs, because that may dictate, hey, I want to change my whole system out. It's not worth buying a new Intel chip because AMD just absolutely blew it out of the water. You know, that's what I'm holding out on. You know, I'm looking at getting a new gaming system. I'm going to retire. Well, I'm going to turn my current gaming box, my all-in-one gaming streaming box, into a dedicated streaming box. And I'm going to be building here on the channel a dedicated gaming box with basically the best performance that I can. And like I said, I'm going to wait and see if there's a 3080 with 20 gigs of VRAM. That might be the way I go. Although I don't know. I'm really curious. Some of these 3090 tests have been really interesting. And like I said, if this was just for gaming, the 3090, I wouldn't do it. Absolutely wouldn't do it. As cool as it would be to actually get the 3090 and have like the biggest GPU on the block, I actually think that unless I truly plan on doing rendering and animation from home there's really zero reason for the cost. I would rather take that extra $700. There were some prices floating around online for the Asus Strix 3090 OC that was talking almost $1,800. Put all that, save them, put $700 into the 3080 and then spend the rest of the money on a new GPU, a new motherboard, a new RAM, what have you. It just makes more sense. You're going to get more performance per dollar in that case. Now, the next question is, when's Intel coming out with their next gen chips? Who knows? Probably going to be spring next year. So, in a perfect case, if you were an incredibly patient person, I would maybe wait till we saw 11th gen chips from Intel, but the reality is I think you're going to really see the scope of the landscape with the Zen 3 announcement on October 8th. So overall, and I know this isn't exciting, my recommendation is to sit back and wait. See what happens throughout October. There's going to be sales. There's going to be Black Friday sales. I don't expect any of these items to go on sale, but maybe some of the peripherals, maybe motherboard sales. With holiday season coming around, everybody's crazy trying to buy up stuff before the end of the year. If you can wait till January, February, I actually think that might be the sweet spot, because at that point, you're really going to have all the information. Again, as you're trying to figure out what components to upgrade, take a look at the resolution you're gaming at. Take a look at your frame rates. Go look at JayzTwoCents. Go look at Gamers Nexus. Go look at everybody else that's actually putting out benchmarks right now, in-game benchmarks. And not the OC stuff where they're dumping cards on LN2, like the real world stock benchmarks that you're going to be able to achieve at home, and see, does it make sense? If I'm gaming at 1080p, am I actually going to see a difference? Am I already at my monitor's limit? Maybe I need a new monitor, those types of things. And really just make the spreadsheet, put the numbers down, and figure out where your money is going to go the farthest. Because just because there is a new shiny GPU out does not mean that's the smartest place to spend your money. And it doesn't mean that's the place that's going to give you the most benefit for your system overall. So I do hope this gave you a little something to think about if you are considering upgrading. I know there's not an all-in-one solution. So again, if you want to come over and continue the discussion, you can do so on Twitch, Twitter, and Discord. There's links to all of that in the description down below. And if you have additional questions, feel free to drop them in the comments and let me know what you think. But overall, I'm really excited. I'll probably be updating some of this information as more comes out. Like I said, the 3090s literally dropped today. So we got some initial benchmarks, but I expect that things are going to change and people are going to start to squeeze out even more performance. As more of the AIBs start coming out, I'd love to see what a Strix 3080 OC looks like right now, and how does that match up? Because there are some interesting things that's happening with overclocking with these initial round of cards, and I'm kind of waiting to see the big picture on that. These cards are not reacting the same as the 2080s did, so there's been some interesting developments there. But anyways, I'll save that for another video. If you guys do like this content, please remember to like and subscribe. I do appreciate it. Of course, it always supports the channel, and we will see you on the next one.